question portion. If you also have any additional questions, and if you find that raising your hand is a better function, and more accessible, feel more than free to raise your hand, and we'll unmute you for you to ask your question. And lastly, the chat, which is at the bottom of the page, will be utilized for any type of technical support you may need. So feel more than free to write anything down there, and we'll help you as things go through. So next.
So a little more about the Yo Disabled Voices of Color series. So this is a monthly installment. So every month we invite disability activists to speak about their advocacy within the community and how youth can get involved with that advocacy. Next. So Dara Baldwin is the Director of National Policy for the Center for Disability Rights Incorporated, or CDR. The CDR is a non-for-profit, community-based advocacy and service organization for people with all types of disabilities. Ms. Baldwin is also responsible for the legislative work, from research and writing, comments, testimonies, letters, and reports, to assisting with advocacy outreach and working with congressional staff, the administration, coalition partners, and others on multiple issue areas for improving the lives of people with disabilities. She has organized and facilitated several national meetings with the White House, Congress, and civil and human rights organizations covering issues of importance and providing recommendations for immediate actions. She also serves as an expert advisor on several research projects or policy movements with organizations such as the African American Policy Forum, the Association of Pedestrian and Bicycle Professionals, Project South, and many others. She has a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and a Master's of Public Administration, both from Rutgers University, where she was a Pi Alpha Alpha honors graduate.
Next. All right, and right before we begin, we want to provide a special thanks towards all the amazing people both on screen and behind the screen, our mentors from CFILC for sharing their wisdom and expertise with us, our guest speaker, Ms. Dara Baldwin, for taking time out of her busy schedule to talk to us about her life as a leader, her wisdom as an advocate, and how we could be able to carry out her message. And finally, towards our amazing ASL interpreters and captioner for providing access needs to you. And with that in mind, let's get started.
Our social media is Twitter at Yo Disabled Proud. Our Instagram is at Yo Disabled and Proud. And our TikTok is at Yo Disabled and Proud.
All right, and let's get started with our questions. We'll start with question 1, which is, well, first I want to say hello, Dara. Welcome to our 5th Yo Disabled Voices of Color speaker series. This series is a way for us to connect with disabled youth on critical topics. Intersectionality, ableism, and disability justice continue to be hot topics amongst disabled youth. Intentionality and making space to provide disabled leaders of color like yourself and spotlighting the magnificent work that you do on behalf of our communities, one of the ways we choose to educate and build leadership skills for disabled youth. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to share some of your own individual experiences with us. So thank you. With that in mind, we like to start our interviews with a simple question that is oftentimes overlooked, which is, the last couple of years have highlighted for us what we need to do as a community and how important check-in has been. With that said, how are you doing and how are you feeling as a disabled leader living through the pandemic?
Well, hi, everyone. Hello from Washington, D.C. I am here with you all on Anacostia and Piscataway Indigenous Stolen Land, and I have to say DC statehood. And I must describe myself. I am a Black woman with short cropped hair. I'm wearing purple earrings. I'm wearing a black shirt and my Ketanji Brown Jackson button. And I'm in front of my social justice wall, which has many different posters and signs of the work I do behind me. And I want to say thank you to CFLIC for doing this and Yo Disabled for having me. So to answer your question, first, let me be very clear, and I think many people know this, I do not have a disability, but because I've been around so long, as they say, I'm part of the family. That's what everyone always says to me. So I just want people to know that. But I think I am among the many millions of people who have been going through this pandemic and have suffered or been living with post-traumatic stress disorder, right? Because of what's going on. And thank you for asking. I'm doing much better now that things have opened up. But during the pandemic, early days in it, because we're still in a pandemic, I am not married and have no children. So I learned what it meant to be isolated and alone, although I'm an only child, so I'm very used to it, but it means something when you can't go out and interact. But I'm much better now. And I did go out and enjoy nature and things like that. That really helped out. So thank you for asking. And I'm enjoying my summer. I'm about to make some really big moves in my life. And so I'm there. That's where I am and how I'm checking in. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And it's nice to meet you. I'm Sophia. So our second question is that you are a member of the She Will Rise Collective, a movement that represents the shared voice and determination of Black women in our pursuit to see the first Black woman confirmed to sit on the Supreme Court of the United States. Would you like to talk about the importance of representation on the Supreme Court and your reaction to the nomination and confirmation of Ketanji Brown Jackson?
Yes, thank you so much for the question. And She Will Rise came around the conversation of quote unquote the courts, as people say. And for years, I worked in the disability community to try to get disabled justices as well. That's how I got into quote unquote working on the courts. And when we say working on the courts, that means getting judges, of diverse judges in those positions, LGBTQ judges, right, disabled, and with this women of color. And it really came out of, I would say, anger and disappointment. Black women at a higher rate, actually, like in this past 2020 election, 93%, right, voted for Joe Biden getting office. It was almost the same, actually higher, a little higher, 96, 97% to put President Obama in. And we had a promise then to even get a Black woman on the short list. When they do the list, the short list, we couldn't accomplish that. And Black women got tired of being the people who go out and get people to register to vote and getting them to vote. And the Democratic Party in particular, but also the Republican Party, not responding to our request to have a Black woman on the Supreme Court. And it is important to have representation because the Supreme Court, we have 3 branches of government, and each one of them holds a very high standard and importance in our lives. We still have to work on all of the areas because even in Congress, legislation area, there are not a lot of Black or BIPOC women. We have a large number this Congress, 118th, the largest we've ever had, but still needed there. We have our first Black woman and BIPOC woman, I'll say, because she's also South Asian, as a vice president in the administration. And now we needed it on the courts. And so the women got together and I was asked to join for my work around the courts, but also because of my work around disabilities. And we were ecstatic to have candidates discuss that they would put a Black woman on the Supreme Court if given a chance. Overjoyed when the chance and opportunity actually happens. And I will say to you, my reaction, in shock, and tears. I cried for almost an hour the day it was announced. I cried for hours after each one of her horrific hearings that she had. They were horrible hearings. And I let people know Black women go through that every day. So you understand and know. BIPOC women, I have to say Black and brown women, go through what she went through during her confirmation hearings. And I cried the day she was confirmed. And then when she was sworn in. So I'm tearful because tears of joy, I have to say. And the last thing I'll say is, well, let me say this. I was shocked because you keep saying you don't think it's going to happen, but at the same time, I always say it's going to happen. And people say to us, how do you keep going? It's because of these wins. And we have had a celebration at least once. Well, we were doing once a week back in June and July. I mean, back in May and June. We're down to like once a month. And people say, you guys are still celebrating. I'm like, we don't get to celebrate a lot of things. We're going to celebrate this. And you see, I'm wearing her button. We're wearing this button until she has her first day on the court. And it is important to have representation because when you're talking about our lives, everyone in the country should have some type of discussion at the Supreme Court. And the last thing I'll say is She Will Rise achieved our first goal, which was to get a Black woman on the court. We are not done. The organization still exists. And now we're moving forward, right? It's time for LGBTQ, right? Open LGBTQ. It's time for Indigenous person. It's time for South Asian. It's time for Asian, right? There's a whole multitude of people and communities that are not represented there. And they want to take our model and we want to help to make sure that happens. So please continue to follow our work. And we're still taking donations. And also if you want a button or any kind of paraphernalia, go to She Will Rise website and purchase. The purchase goes towards that future work.
Wow. Like, honestly, like being like a young woman of color, for me, I find that so empowering because like more often than not, like it's hard to see someone that looks like you in a position of power. And especially when you fit like more and more groups, like whether like you are a person of color, you're a woman, you are queer, you are so on, you start fitting more and more categories of different things, you feel more of that inner sense of oppression by this country. So like being able to see like people that look like you in those positions is definitely emotional in a really amazing way. Like I totally cried. I'll be honest as well. I was crying every single day when I would see friends. They're like, why are you such an emotional mess? And I'm like, they're like, because it's happiness. Like there's this actual pure tears of joy. And I felt it in my core and my soul, especially with everything that's currently happening in this country. I think that was such a W, like, and being able to know that that gives like one the sense of hope for the future and hope for like that there's a better tomorrow that's awaiting us. So yeah, and that goes straight into my next question, which is in your opinion, how can diverse youth groups come together to express the intersectionalities of our lives and identities without being ableist, but instead creating a more inclusive space?
Yes, this is a very good question. And I am so glad, Jessica, that, I wasn't the only one crying and admitting that I cried. But it is important. And I've had this conversation specifically after the Dobbs case was, the decision came down, because everyone is moving to try to work to fix this situation. And it's important for us to be involved with groups who uplift and are engaged with and have always supported disabled groups. And I know I'm being recorded and I don't care. Planned Parenthood is not one of those groups. NARAL is not one of those groups. Sorry, ASL interpreter and captionist, NARAL is NARAL. That's another abortion rights groups, mostly run by white women, non-disabled white women. And there's not a Planned Parenthood facility in the country that's fully accessible or even engages in accessibility. And we talked to them for 5 years straight. And then I walked away and said, I can't talk to you anymore. So to answer your question about how does this happen? First and foremost, we need to have serious conversations with organizations about what it means to have a disability, right? Disability sensitivity and disability laws. In that, not in that order, but those three things. And when organizations decide that they want to interact and do those things, that's when we can say, yes, we're in solidarity with you, and yes, you are our allies. How does that come about? It comes about through conversation. I am very much one, if you follow me on Twitter or on Instagram, I'm very much the person to call people out. But I think it's important that you call people out with the opportunity to say, but I want to help you to be better. Right. And so we have to do that. And I think there's a need for us to have respect for people who are saying they want to engage with us, and then they'll give you that respect back. The other thing I think youth need to know, especially you young, I'm much older than you, so I'm gonna say you young people I have a problem with, is the lives you've led is about instant gratification. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I tell people, but when I grew up, you're gonna laugh, but if you went to see the Minions movie, you understand this because it was 1976. The phone, you had to dial a phone. It took you, it was a circular machine that you hit a number, and it took a long time to make a phone call. You are growing up in a life where, number one, you probably don't call anybody. And if you do, you just hit a button for their name and it rings right to whoever you're calling. So that's the life you guys live and know. I think patience is a virtue, they say, right? And it's something that is missing from that. And so when you want to engage with groups, you have to have that patience, because you're not dealing with a machine, right? You're not dealing with an iPhone. When you talk to people, you're dealing with people, and people have the same feelings you have. Your frustration, they're frustrated. You're angry, they're angry. So you have to have that. It's called compassion, right? It's called empathy. And so we have to have that. But at the same time, you have to have courage, because you have to say what's wrong and then give the solutions. Right. And then also when you're coming into groups, the work, it is work. And you can't say, well, this is the problem and you need to fix it. You have to say, this is the problem, this is the recommendation, and here's how I can assist you, or we can work together to fix this. Because it's also, right, it's not all of your job, right? Just as a Black person, it's not my job to get you to understand racism, but I will get you to a place where you can talk about it and read about it and go learn, right? I can only do so much for you. So we have to, I think young people need to understand that. And I do think you guys are amazing. This generation, all these generations behind me, it's amazing. Look at where we are in this world. I know people think we're in bad places, but at the same time, there wouldn't be a Ketanji Brown Jackson without the youth movement, without youth who came out in droves to vote, who came out in droves to protest in 2020 against what happened around police violence. And the world saw those people, and heard those people and engaged with those people. So that's a very big part of it. And the last thing I'll say for youth, and I think it's needed, is that you are valuable, and don't let anybody else tell you you're not. And if if you continue to go to a table and they continue to disrespect you and say you're not valuable, it's time for you to move on. It is not an easy thing to cut loose and move on and move away from people, especially if you develop a relationship with them. But you have to acknowledge that, and move on. And I tell people, when you're in coalition and you're working in coalition, treat it the same way you treat any kind of relationship. Right. And if hopefully you're at that space in your life where if you wouldn't be abused by your partner, your family, then you definitely shouldn't be abused by your coalition members. So I always say that. And as you asked Jessica, me, check in. Check in on your health, mental, physical, and emotional self at all times. And check in on your coalition partners. That shows solidarity, that shows compassion, that shows love. And I think that's what will get you, moving towards the goal that we all want, and also put you in leadership, because you're coming at it from a different space.
Before I let Sophia continue, I must say that your words definitely hit hard. Because like I've been in multiple positions where like I'm the only woman of color. I'm like the youngest one. I am so on. So like oftentimes like it's tiresome because like I shouldn't have to educate so many people about the racism that is endured, like, and so on. That should be something that people should be willing to like come together and be able to wanting to get to understand that. And that oftentimes is such a big obstacle to be able to confront, and very emotional turmoil where like I cried to my parents because it's like it's hard. Like this can be definitely very hard. So like thank you. I mean that wholeheartedly. Like your words really are powerful in the sense of like being able to find like that sense of middle ground and knowing when you need to step back, because sometimes like there's certain times and locations where like you really do need to take time for yourself and step away from certain things, which can be like hurtful, not necessarily physically hurtful, but emotionally tiresome. So thank you very much for that.
You're welcome.
So you're involved with the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding, the Association of Pedestrian and Bicycle Professionals, the Transit Center, the Compact for Thriving Communities, and the Transportation Equity Caucus, among many other organizations. Can you talk about the importance of integrating disability, justice, and equity into our urban environments and our systems of transportation?
Sure, and I'm glad you guys honed in on the transportation. It's an area where people forget and don't really and get themselves involved in. And transportation. So I'm the co-chair of the Transportation Equity Caucus, and we also incorporate urban development. And the Campaign for Housing and Community Development is community development, right? Community developers will develop something, a community, without input from the community. For years they did that. That was the model. And we have worked over the years to change that. And I think it's slowly happening a little more and a little better. And what happens is a lot of people want to create a development in a community that fits into three things. One is what they think their community needs. The second is the cost that they are willing to pay. And the third is a one and done. And those are three horrible ways to create a community, as we take. So we come from the space, first of all, inequity is fair and impartial when you create something. So we come from the space that one is you, government worker usually, and you entity do not know what the community wants. Only that community in that neighborhood knows what they want. And so you have to get your information from them. Two is you need to be ready to pay any amount. There is no amount of money, right? Because if you're going to make a community, it's a community who pays their taxes in many different ways, right? Because people think just because you rent an apartment, you don't pay taxes. And I have to let them know and say they eat in a restaurant, they go to the grocery store. Those are other ways to pay taxes here. And then the third one, when they one and done, is that a community is organic. It continues to thrive and grow and change because we are people. So that I just say that there, right? That's the concept of using racial justice and equity in urban development, in community development, in transportation. Then the other side is, yes, they never think about being accessible, or they themselves think they're the experts and tell us all the time, this is accessible. And we just look at it, I tell them, I say, did you have a tester? And they don't understand that. And here I'll give you 2 examples of policy where it's important. So I'll do one for transportation and one for community development. So one in transportation is, and it happened during the pandemic, using our streets and who gets to use our streets. Everyone wants to create walkable communities, and we're like, rollable, walkable, and rollable, right? They don't understand that. They also don't understand universal design, that if you make it for everyone, right, that's equity, fair and impartial, it'll be great. I'm sure, I don't know what, people from around the country, but they're bike lanes. Many people right now here, and this is intersectionality when it comes to policy. You want to be environmentally right. We're telling people give up the cars, right? Like, I live here in DC. I haven't had a car since 2013. And I think we're at like 52% of our city, district, or whatever we are, do not own a car, because we worked towards that, right? Well, anyway, they have to take other forms of transportation, and many people are using bicycles, even disabled folks. And they've created these bike lanes that are not accessible, that usually people with disabilities use tricycles or hand bikes, which have a larger wheelbase, a wider wheelbase. So if you, as a disabled person on your tricycle or hand bike or special bike, get on that bike lane, you'll cross over. And the person coming the other way can't come because it's not accessible. So I unfortunately, I was in the mayor's office, and unfortunately they wouldn't listen to me here in DC, why I only lasted 1 year and I'm not a government worker. And they built bike lanes here that disabled people can't use. So disabled people are not safe when they ride their bikes here. And everybody, that's not equity, right? And that's not doing it. So that's like one transportation. Also the creation of bike programs where you want to rent a bike, any bike shares, the bike share programs are not accessible. There's like only 4 or 5 around the country. They're just starting to do this. And I did a whole training around this, and I'll send you the link for it if you want to watch it. We did a 2-day training with officials and jurisdictions to tell them, not only are you not doing this, but you're violating the ADA, right? Because anybody who takes government funds, you have to follow the ADA. And there's not a program in the country that's not taking government funds. And even if private people are doing it, like in New York, they try to fight us because Citibank is paying for it. And I was like, well, they got to follow Title III because that's for private entities. Okay, then community development. Community development, people are building a lot of, like I said, walkable, right, rollable communities, great. They also are creating a lot of outside spaces. It was before the pandemic, but I think even more now because of what happened during the pandemic, to create playgrounds and walkways and roll, they don't think about rolling. And those playgrounds are not accessible. And community development means that you're creating something where a community can develop itself and be better. And, the conversations I've had with people who him and ha, which means they're like, oh God, it has to be, oh, here she comes again. And I'm like, yeah, you can't have a playground that's not accessible. A mother or a family member person brings their children to the park, and if they have 4 children, one's disabled, the 3 kids get to play, and the disabled child is sitting with her, or and just that mother. I said, it's not fair, it's not right. Or I've seen where they're like, oh, we created a track where people could walk and roll. And yes, the track is accessible, but the pathway of travel, which is what we call how you get to that spot, is not accessible. It's up on a hill, like a straight up hill. And I'm like, someone in a wheelchair can't roll up there. Someone in crutches or something, it's a lot, right? Or coming back down is not safe. So that's where they don't think about disability. So it's important. We live what I call multi, short for multi, marginal lives. Right? Not multiply. We don't multiply but we live multi-marginal lives. So, African-American, transgender woman who is disabled, a refugee, formerly incarcerated, they exist. And we have to make sure we create communities that are safe, first and foremost, and safety is defined by Black and brown folks, BIPOC folks, much different than it is for white folks. And second, that is conducive to having that life, to having a life in the community. So it's imperative, transportation is, I always say it's the chicken before the egg. Do you need employment, housing, or transportation? You need all three, right? To live in a community. And so it's imperative that we do that.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. I'm studying urban development right now, actually. And I live in Fresno, and a report just got released a couple days ago about how we're one of the worst cities in the United States for pedestrians. But if you look at the report closely, it's across income lines. So areas that are richer are so much safer for pedestrians and bikers than areas that have concentrated poverty. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right. Our next question would be, what advice would you give to youth as someone who's been very much involved in disability advocacy? What advice would you provide youth who want to get involved in disability advocacy? Is there any advice you would give to youth interested in legislative work and uplifting the voices of marginalized communities?
Sure. So to get involved in legislative work, the first thing I would say is learn about civics. Unfortunately, that has been taken out of a lot of schools and education. And there are multiple programs for you to do that. If you Google civics education, with the 2 words, they'll come up. Some of them are free. Some of them, may charge you, but not a lot. It is important for you to know your rights, but at the same time, know the laws and programs that protect you and how it works and how it functions. So that's the basic, right, education part of it. The other side of legislative work is networking. And a lot of people hate that word, but I think it's a great word. And part of networking is remembering people's names, remembering people's titles, and then also connecting with people all of the time. Now, being a disability advocate, I know that may be difficult for a lot of people because of their disability. And because people always say to me, how do you remember people's names so well? I took classes in networking. There are classes, and look, anything you want, there's classes in there, right? And offered at civic centers and things like that. I'm also a Toastmaster, which is a program about speaking, and part of Toastmasters was teaching this. And they're experts who would give you tricks to how you remember people's names. So I think it's great especially for people with developmental disabilities or TBIs, because they teach you these tricks. And for me, what they do is they kind of sit and talk with you and learn who you are and how you function and how you talk. And I had a woman who taught me, and she said, oh, I like movies, I like history, I like to read. So she told me, when you meet someone, connect them to characters you like. And that's how I remember people's names. It is really interesting because I'm like, oh, okay. Like, you're Jessica, right? And I like, Jessica, the tomb runner, right? The character there. Or I like Jessica, from a show, and I understand and know that name. Your Zofia, it's different, so I connected to Sophia, right? And so I'll say, but it's a Z there, and like Sophia Loren, I like Sophia Loren, so I'm going to remember your name. So there are tricks to do that, right? And networking is also a way for you to come out of your shell, to come out, and change and be different. And I say that because many people, like, learning the policy and learning how to write policy, all of that is very important, and you'll get that in your education. What college and universities don't do, and which I think is harmful, specifically the BIPOC student, is they don't teach you the things outside of, like, in life. And so you have to learn those things, which is networking, White folks move ahead and get ahead in what they do because of the networking. Although I have a bachelor's in political science, I started as a business major at one of the best top schools in the country, as Florida A&M School of Business. And my first year, they taught us networking. And I had 2 classes, which my mother was like, why am I paying you to learn golf and tennis? And because most of the business deals are done on the golf course or the tennis court. So you don't have to really know how to play them. You just need to know like how to keep score and talk to someone, right? Like in golf, the question is, what's your handicap? If you say that to me, and I tell people that's the only time you use that word handicap is when you ask somebody their golf score, what's your handicap? Because in golf, that's you tell them your score, and you need to know the lower the number, right? The worse they are. It's right. It's a neg, like, so you have to be the lower the number, the better they are. They're a good golfer. That means the least swings it took for them to get the ball in the hole. So if you don't know those things, you can't have a conversation with that business person, right? So I hate to play golf. I really can't play golf because I have allergies to grass and stuff. But I understand the game and can talk. So it's the same thing about politics. If you in policy, read the paper, or read and know what's going on in the world. You can't talk to politicians and policy folks and not know what's going on in the world. And like I said, be diligent, and understand and know that most people who do really good policy do it from the streets to the suites, and that's how I do it. I want to talk to communities and find out what communities, like I said, in the urban development, you can't tell me what the community wants. I have to go to the community, ask them. And I find that I am a better policy person here in DC, because staffers are people who work for both House and Senate members, and actually the White House call me and ask, do you know people in our district that we can talk to about this situation? I said, oh yeah, hold on, let's find it. Like, you name a state, I can give you 2 to 3 groups to say, okay, let me reach out to them. And it makes you a better policy person. People here in DC only know the Beltway and they don't know what's going on. So even if you're doing state policy, don't just stay in your state capital, get out and go into the community. So those are kinds of things that they don't teach you in school, right? In the book, that's not in the textbook. And also how your state house or how your policy functions is not something you're going to learn in the book. I learned how Congress runs literally before the pandemic. I used to spend all my time in the hallways, and knowing the rules of the House floor is not something that's in the textbook. It's something that staffers told you. It's something that they gave you information and you learned it, and I learned it. That's how I learned it. And so you have to understand and know that too. Be a life learner. You're going to learn something new every single day. So that I hope, people understand policy is not, and doing legislative work is more than just writing bills, is more than just getting the bill passed. And then the last thing I'll say is that part too, is that people will get bills passed, whether it be in the state or or their county, wherever, and then they leave it alone. And they're just so happy they have a celebration. Like, yay, it's over. No, that's actually when the work really, really starts, because now you need to make sure it's implemented correctly, right? Why we still have so many problems with the ADA not being enforced, right? Not pushing and saying we need you to enforce this law. And so, because people, walked away, rolled away, said, okay, it was passed, it's done. I mean, a lot of people worked on it, of course, those first 10 years to get things out, but here we are 32 years later, and we're still waiting for guidances to come out on a law that passed 32 years ago. So I just say that, it takes a lot, but it's get yourself a good mentor too, is something else I would say. So those are the things the advice I would give.
Yeah, that's really impactful, especially as a young person. I've always been interested in law, and in high school, like, I would have friends and they're like, oh, I have a internship at a law firm this summer. I'm like, oh, how did you get that? And they're like, oh, it's my dad's friend, because my dad's a lawyer. And you have to realize you have to do so many things for yourself. You have to put yourself out there, even if you're not confident, because like all of your like rich white friends, like their parents are networking for them, and their parents, rich friends are networking for them. And yeah, so our last question, I don't know if we have any Q&A questions in the chat, but if you have a question, now would be the time. So the last question for me is, you have extensive knowledge of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Access Carrier Act of 1986, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and other disability and civil rights laws. Do you feel like it's important for youth with disabilities to be knowledge about legislation pertaining to people with disabilities so they can better advocate for themselves? Or how has knowing so much about these pieces of legislation enabled you to advocate for yourself better, if it has?
So yes, as I was saying earlier, in order to fight for your rights, you need to know, right, your rights. So you need to know the law. I think it is imperative that advocates, activists know the laws in which, they're talking about and covers the person's life, the people's lives. The ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, is one of the easier civil rights. It's one of the shorter ones too. It's only 5 titles, because the other ones have like 9 and 10 titles. I say that. When I was involved in advocacy and chairing some advocacy groups, like I said, from the streets to the suites, that were people in the community, we made it a requirement. In order to be part of our working group, you had to take the ADA test. Now, on ada.gov, there is a program, it's free, which ada.gov, their ADA resource centers. Each federal entity is broken down in 10 regions. You name a DHH, the Department of Health and Human Services, there's 10 regions. So the ADA resources are 10 regions. Anyway, you can go on and take this test. It is, you read Title I, and then you take the test for Title I. You read Title II, and then you take the test for Title II. You can start it in January and stop and come back and take it in February and March, right? It'll show you your score. But anyway, we advocates who came to the working group, I would say we would love for you to score at 85 and above. Now, of course, it was, they did it, but and then the people who did do it said, you're right. Because I will say this, and it's not just disabled folks, but because I'm around disabled folks more, people will use their emotions and what they think the ADA says. And I have to sit them down and say, okay, that's not what the ADA says. Let's talk about this, because it's how they feel it should be. And I'm like, yeah, but that's not what it says. And so you don't want that, because the opposition, let me let you know, they know it. They know how to get what they want to get. They may not know the ADA, which a lot of them don't, but they know how to make you confused and not understand. And when you know what you know, and someone, they can't do that to you, right? You can rattle it off. Just like I said to you, when the bike share program in New York tried to come to us and say, well, Citibank pays for this bike share program. And I went back to them and said, oh, okay, that's Title III of the ADA, because those are private entities, right? Like, as if, right? Like when Lyft tried to tell us we're not a transportation company. And because they didn't want to be accessible. Yes, not only me, they told the courts this. They put a memo into the court and said this. And we were all like, well, what kind of program, like, what are you if you're not a transportation? And they tried to say we're a hospitality. And I said, well, that's good. That's the use hospitality with the hotels and motels. You think they're not, that's Title III. It's still, right? So if you can't come back and say to someone what you're violating or how, then you're not effective, right, in your work. So it's important to know that. It's important to know your rights as far as it comes to having a basic knowledge. You don't have to be a lawyer about this or anything. And what we also do is we encourage people to take trainings. Those ADA resources groups do annual conferences in the region. Then there's a national conference that you could go to. And for me, even I've been doing this for 14 years now. Every 2 years, I go back and take my trainings, because you learn something new. I don't have to do it every year, but I like to do it every 2 years. and continue to get yourself knowledgeable about these laws. The other law that you didn't mention was the IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It's important to know that one as well. And it is also important for you, if you want to write about what's happening, even if you want to blog, right? Because blogs are not peer reviewed or any of those kinds of things, but you can't write things and say what the ADA says, and that's not what it says, right? And just having the knowledge of where to go, having the resources, like knowing that an ADA resource place exists, helps whatever group you're working with, so that they have resources and they know where to go, and they know how to file a complaint, right? That's another thing, learn how to file a complaint and those kinds of things. So I think it's always important for you to do that. When I came into the disability community, it wasn't like I didn't know disabilities, because I was a child advocate in New Jersey. And then when I moved to DC to do this work, and